The flight into the Arctic was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The small twin prop rattled through pockets of turbulence, each shuddering drop making the loose bolts along the fuselage groan like an old man in pain. The windows were rimmed with frost that blurred the view outside, but I could still make out the endless expanse of white below, a desert made of ice and snow. The world felt emptied of all color except for the sickly gray of the clouds and the sharp blue veins of frozen rivers. When we landed on the crude strip carved into the permafrost, the sound of the engines faded and the silence pressed in like a weight. I stepped out into a blast of cold so brutal it felt like my skin was being flayed. The wind carried tiny shards of ice that stung my face and found every gap in my parka. I tasted metal in the air, sharp and biting, as though the world itself was rusting away. The station rose in the distance, a cluster of weather-beaten buildings half buried in snowdrifts, their walls scarred with decades of storms. Rust streaked down the corrugated siding, and the few windows I could see were iced over, reflecting nothing but a distorted version of myself. A wooden sign leaned at an angle near the entrance, the paint long gone, words carved into it by hand. When I trudged inside, boots crunching on ice-packed steps, the heat didn't greet me as much as it smothered me, thick and stale, carrying the smell of oil, mildew, and old iron pipes. The air had that heavy tang of a place sealed too long, where breath lingers and mold waits. The first face I saw belonged to Helen. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with lines etched deep into her face not just from age, but from years of squinting against the glare of snow. Her hair was tied back in a rough knot, strands of gray escaping like brittle wire. She gave me the sort of look you give someone you don't expect to last long, polite but already mourning. Behind her came Anders, tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running from his temple down to his cheek like someone had carved into him with a blade of ice. He didn't smile when he shook my hand, his grip crushing and cold even through gloves. Then there was Carter, the youngest of the group, who barely met my eyes. His nervous hands fiddled with the zipper on his jacket, tugging it up and down, as if that small sound kept him sane. They spoke little as they led me deeper into the station. The hallways echoed with each step, every creak of metal loud enough to sound like someone else was walking just behind us. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing off a pale glow that flickered now and then, plunging corners into shadow before sputtering back to life. At last, in the common room, Helen pointed to a binder on the table. It was thick, heavy, the cover stained a dark brown that at first I thought was just rust or age. But when I leaned closer, the smell hit me, copper, sharp, unmistakable, blood. The title was scratched into the front with something jagged, Survival Rules. "Read them," Anders said flatly, as if that was all the welcome I was going to get. The binder looked old, but the blood was fresh, wet in places, smearing when I brushed it by accident. My stomach tightened. I wanted to laugh, to tell them it was some hazing ritual for newcomers, but none of them were smiling. I flipped it open. The first page was written in a careful, almost reverent script, the letters uneven from the way the pen had dragged through thick, drying blood. Rule number 1. Never go outside alone after dark. Rule number 2, lock every door, always, even if you're inside. Rule number 3, never open the door after dark with a witness. Rule number 4, keep every light burning after midnight. Do not let shadows gather. Rule number 5, do not respond to radio calls for help after midnight. Rule number 6, never look twice at a familiar face in the snow. Rule 7, do not sleep alone, ever. The list went on, each rule stranger than the last. Some bordered on superstition, others read like practical safety measures distorted into something else. I looked up, expecting someone to laugh, to tell me it was a joke. Instead, Helen was staring at me with grim intensity, her arms crossed tight across her chest. "We didn't write those," she said. "We follow them." Something about the way she said it, sharp, absolute, like scripture, sent a chill crawling up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I tried to shrug it off, to hide my unease. What happens if you don't? Anders turned his scarred face toward me. "You don't ask that question, not if you plan on staying alive." For a moment, the silence deepened. I became aware of every sound, the wind clawing at the outer walls, the hum of the generator somewhere below, the faint drip of melting ice in the corner. The air felt too still, too watchful, as though the station itself was waiting to hear if I would obey. Later that night, as I lay in the narrow bunk assigned to me, the binder's words burned in my head. I told myself it was paranoia, isolation, playing tricks, the kind of myth people invent to make sense of an unforgiving landscape. Still, I found myself rising quietly to double-check that the door was locked, my breath clouding in the chill of the hallway. The rules were nonsense, I thought, but the blood was real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't yet finished drying. The next morning, I sat alone at the table in the common room, the binder open in front of me. The blood had darkened overnight, turning from a wet crimson to a tacky brown, but when I touched the edge of one page, it still left a faint stain on my fingertip. Whoever had written these words in blood, it hadn't been long ago. The rules stretched across dozens of pages. Some were practical, at least on the surface. Keep all doors locked at all times, even if you're inside. Check heaters every hour. If the temperature dips suddenly, find the source. Keep food sealed when not in use. Do not eat alone after dark. Those made sense, I told myself. This was the Arctic, locks against storms, heaters to prevent frostbite, food kept secure from vermin. But then the rules shifted into the strange, the kind that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. Never answer the radio after midnight, no matter who is calling. Do not look out the windows after 2 a.m. Don't acknowledge shadows in the snow. They will follow if you do. If you hear your name whispered from outside, stay silent. The handwriting was jagged, uneven. Sometimes it dipped where the writer's hand must have trembled. Some rules had been written, then crossed out, rewritten below in darker, wetter strokes, as though they were always changing, always being updated. I heard a floorboard creak behind me and turned. Helen stood in the doorway with a steaming mug of coffee, her eyes locked on the binder. "Reading already?" she asked, her voice low, almost disapproving. "I couldn't sleep," I admitted. "Figured I'd get familiar with the manual." Her expression didn't change. She came closer, setting the mug down in front of me. "It's not a manual. Don't think of it like that. It's law." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but before I could, Anders came into the room, heavy boots thudding against the metal floor. He grabbed the binder and snapped it shut, almost angrily. "Enough," he said. His scar seemed to catch the dim light, making the groove in his face look deeper, harsher. I frowned. "Don't waste my head on it? You've got rules in here about shadows and voices. What the hell does that mean?" Anders didn't answer. He looked at Helen, and something passed between them, something quiet, rehearsed. Helen finally said, "You'll see. And when you do, you'll understand why we don't talk about it." Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was final, the kind of tone that didn't leave room for argument. The rest of the day was spent on chores, as though to distract me. Carter showed me how to check the heaters, how to listen to the low groan they made when they were straining against the cold. The sound reminded me of a whale song, low and mournful, echoing through the pipes. Every so often, I'd hear a sharp crack from outside, ice splitting, snow shifting, and my stomach would jump until Carter assured me it was normal. Normal. That word lost all meaning up here. By nightfall, we gathered in the common room again, the binder still sitting on the table like a silent overseer. The others avoided looking at it, but I couldn't stop my eyes from drifting to it. Finally, I asked, "Who wrote them? The rules? Who sat down with a pen and—" I trailed off, thinking of the tacky brown smear on my fingers. And their own blood? No one answered. Anders drank his tea like I hadn't spoken. Carter fiddled with his zipper. Helen stared into the flickering light bulb overhead, as though she was lost somewhere far away. When the silence stretched too long, I laughed nervously. You guys can't seriously expect me to just follow a set of bloody rules without knowing why? This time, Anders did look at me, and his eyes were harder than the ice outside. You'll follow them, he said, because if you don't, you won't last a night, and you'll wish the cold was all you had to worry about. His words lingered long after everyone else had gone to bed. I stayed awake, sitting in my bunk, listening to the distant groans of the station walls. Every crack of shifting ice sounded close. Rule 22. If you find a new rule, follow it. Don't question where it came from. My breath caught in my throat. I ran my finger across the words. The blood smeared wet against my skin. Someone had written this last night, but I hadn't seen anyone near the binder. I hadn't heard the scratch of a pen. The station gave another deep groan, and somewhere in the pipes, water dripped steadily, like a heartbeat. For the first time since arriving, I pulled my blanket over my head like a child. It wasn't the cold that kept me awake. It was the realization that the rules weren't just relics. They were alive, and they weren't finished yet. The first week passed in a rhythm that was strange but not unbearable. Every morning, I joined Carter on weather checks, climbing up the narrow stairwell to the rooftop instruments where the wind screamed in our ears like a living thing. We scraped ice off sensors, logged temperatures that always hovered in the realm of inhuman, and recorded the barometric pressure in numbers that felt meaningless to me but made Carter nod grimly, like they confirmed something he already feared. After that, I shadowed Anders during equipment maintenance. He showed me how to bleed the air from the generators, how to listen for the faint rattle that meant the oil was too thick, how to check for ice building up in vents. The work was repetitive, but there was something grounding about it too. Tasks had an order. You could complete them, tick them off a list. I found myself clinging to that structure. Still, no matter how ordinary the chores seemed, there were moments, cracks in the routine, when unease snipped in. I noticed it first in the shadows. Out on the roof one evening, I watched the snow whip across the ice plains, and for a second, I swore I saw something long and lean moving just beyond the floodlight's edge. The wind pushed everything westward, but this shadow dragged the other way, slow and deliberate, until it melted back into the storm. Later, while hauling supplies from storage, I froze at the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow just outside the wall. Slow, heavy. Someone circling the station. When I peered through the frosted window, the world was empty, white stretching forever in every direction. Not a single track disturbed the drifts. Yet the sound went on for another minute, circling, until it stopped beneath the very window where I stood. That night, I told myself it was tricks of the wind, the groaning of settling ice. The mind can make monsters out of echoes. I wanted to believe that. Helen, of course, knew better. I found her in the kitchen one afternoon stirring a pot of soup that smelled faintly of powdered broth and something earthy I couldn't place. She didn't look up when she spoke. "You've been watching the snow, haven't you?" Her voice startled me. I hadn't said a word. "I saw shadows," I admitted cautiously, "and footsteps, I think, but there was nothing there." Finally, she looked at me, eyes sharp and clear like ice chips. "There's always something there. The rules keep them out. That's all that matters." I almost laughed, but the way she held my gaze made the sound die in my throat. Helen wasn't joking. She wasn't even trying to scare me. She believed every word she said, and for some reason, that terrified me more than anything I'd seen in the snow. That evening, as we sat together in the common room, she told me more. Not much, never more than a few sentences at a time, as though speaking too plainly might summon the very things she described. "I've been here 15 years, she said, her hands folded neatly on her lap. "Teams come and go. Some last the winter, some don't. The difference is always the same. The rules," I whispered. She nodded once. "The rules." Her eyes flicked toward the binder on the table, and she lowered her voice further. Don't think about who wrote them. Don't think about why. Just follow them. That's all you can do. Her words stayed with me long into the night. The days blurred into one another. Hours of data, repairs, routine, the sameness of the white world pressing in on every side. But I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The shadows always lingered just outside the light's reach, shifting against the storm. The footsteps returned, sometimes faint, sometimes so close I could swear the walls trembled with them. Once, while writing in the logbook, I caught movement in the frosted glass of the window. A human outline, broad shoulders, a face, blurred but undeniably shaped like a face. I looked away instantly, my heart pounding, remembering one of the rules. Never look twice at a familiar face in the snow. The binder's words followed me like a curse. Then came the night I heard it. I was alone in the common room, finishing the day's notes. The others had gone to bed, their doors closed and locked behind them. The wind howled, a constant animal outside, but beneath it, I heard something else. A voice. At first I thought it was the pipes, groaning under pressure. But then I froze, pen halfway to the paper. Because the voice wasn't just any voice. It was mine. I heard myself calling from outside the door. The exact timbre, the same cadence. My own voice echoing back at me, muffled by walls but unmistakable. Let me in. The pen slipped from my fingers. My chest tightened, lungs refusing to expand. I turned slowly toward the door. Through the tiny pane of frosted glass set into its steel, I could see nothing, only the dark press of the storm outside. Then it came again, louder this time, my voice, urgent. Let me in. Every rule I'd read screamed through my mind. The binder's weight sat heavy in my gut. Never open the door after dark without a witness. Never respond to voices calling from outside. The handle shivered once, as though something cold pressed against it. Then the voice outside whispered again, softer, closer to the glass, each syllable vibrating through my skull. Please, let me in. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My own voice begged me from the other side, and every instinct screamed that if I so much twitched, the door would swing open and whatever was out there would pour inside. The lights overhead flickered once, buzzing, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw my reflection staring back from the glass, not in the room with me, but on the wrong side of the door. Then the light steadied, and the voice was gone. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. The night he vanished, the cold seemed sharper, like the air itself had teeth. I remember sitting in the mess hall with a mug of stale coffee, trying to will warmth into my hands, when the new hire, Ethan, barely 22, cocky, all swagger and city-bred impatience, decided he'd had enough of living by ghost stories. It was just past 11. The night outside had fallen into that absolute Arctic blackness, the kind that feels like standing at the edge of space. The only light in the world came from the station windows, dim yellow rectangles swallowed by frost. I heard the clatter of boots in the corridor before Ethan appeared, bundled up, muttering curses about paranoid nonsense. He was headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Helen asked, her voice sharp. She was always watching, half mother, half warden, her eyes snapping to the binder of rules on the wall. "You can't go out there. It's dark." "I just left my damn flashlight in the generator shed," Ethan said. His grin was too wide, the kind people wear to cover nerves. "You guys act like shadows are gonna bite me. It's a shed. I'll be 30 seconds. Helen's chair scraped back so hard the legs squealed against the tile. "Rule 3. She jabbed a finger at the list on the wall, the crimson lettering gleaming in the weak light. "Never open the door after dark without another witness." Ethan rolled his eyes. "So what? Someone stands next to me while I pick up a flashlight? Big deal. I'll be right back." Helen's chair scraped back so hard the legs squealed against the tile. "Rule 3. She jabbed a finger at the list on the wall, the crimson lettering gleaming in the weak light.
Never open the door after dark without another witness. Ethan rolled his eyes. So what? Someone stands next to me while I pick up a flashlight? Big deal. I'll be right back. I wanted to speak up, but the words stuck. A part of me, the logical, rational part, was tired of rules written in blood. Tired of pretending that ghost stories controlled our lives. Another part, though, the deeper, instinctual part, clenched like a fist around my gut. My skin prickled with the memory of hearing my own voice outside the door just the night before. "Don't," Helen snapped. She grabbed his sleeve. "You don't understand." But he yanked free. His grin had turned brittle. "You people are insane." Then he unlatched the heavy steel door.
The wind surged inside immediately, tearing through the corridor, carrying with it the smell of iron and something sharp, almost electrical. My ears popped from the pressure change. The door groaned as he pulled it open, and then he was gone. Not gone in the way people usually disappear. There was no scream, no stumble into the snow, no shadow darting away. One moment Ethan stood in the doorway, and the next there was nothing but the empty dark howling against the threshold. His parka hung for half a second, weightless, before crumpling in a heap. A single boot, his right one, sat just over the line of the door, rim encased in frost. Steam curled off it as if it had been burned by cold fire. We all froze. The door slammed shut on its hydraulic hinge, sealing us in silence so thick I could hear my own pulse. I couldn't move. My mind rejected what my eyes had seen. People don't just vanish. They fall, they're dragged, they fight, they leave behind signs. But Ethan had left nothing. Nothing but an empty boot and an echo in my skull. Helen's voice broke the stillness, hoarse and shaken. "That's what happens when you break the rules." Nobody argued. Nobody could. We didn't retrieve his parka. Nobody crossed that line. We left it there, a frozen bundle slumped against the steel, the boot on the threshold like a warning marker. The rest of the night bled out in silence. We sat in the mess hall, staring at our cups, our bowls, the table, anywhere but each other. The Arctic wind hammered at the walls, rattling bolts and seams, until the whole building shivered like an animal trying to shake something off its back. Every groan in the metal sounded like a voice trying to get in. Nobody slept. I lay in my bunk, staring at the frost feathering across the window above me, veins of white branching wider with each breath of cold. I thought of Ethan's grin, the way it faltered just before the door opened. And I thought of the boot, rimmed with frost, steaming in the dark. I could still taste the air from that moment, metallic and bitter, like licking a battery. The rules weren't just paranoia. They weren't tradition. They were law, as binding and merciless as physics. Helen's words replayed in my mind. That's what happens when you break the rules. And still, some stubborn part of me whispered, but why? Why these rules? Why blood-written commandments in a place built for science? What lurked in the dark that didn't just kill, but erased? The next morning, the station was quieter than usual. Breakfast was untouched, coffee set cooling in pots. Everyone moved slower, their eyes dull, like their spirits had been scraped hollow. Derek, the mechanic, was the first to speak about it, his voice low and grim. "We don't talk about it again. Officially, he's missing. That's what the report says." "Missing?" I echoed. "He disappeared right in front of us." He looked at me then, his gaze hard, tired, older than his years. "And you think anyone's gonna believe that? You think Command wants to hear about boots and shadows? They'll shut us down, pull funding, leave us stranded out here." Helen slammed her cup down. "Better stranded than dead." The argument died quickly, swallowed by the station's endless hum. The heaters rattling, the pipes knocking like distant footsteps. I felt a wedge driven between us all. Trust frayed. Every glance carried suspicion. Who would be next to slip? Who would test the rules? That evening, when the light faded and shadows crawled back across the snowfields, I found myself drawn to the binder again.
The rules glistened under the flickering fluorescent bulb, each line written in thick, dark strokes. Fresh, always fresh. I ran my finger just above the words of Rule 3, not touching, just close enough to feel the imagined tackiness of blood. Never open the door after dark without another witness. The letter seemed to pulse in the weak light. I thought of Ethan's grin, the way the dark swallowed him like he'd never been. No scream, no drag marks, no body. Just absence. The rules weren't suggestions. They weren't even warnings. They were promises. That realization left me colder than the Arctic air outside. Later that night, as I tried to sleep, I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, low, moaning, seeping through the cracks of the old walls. But then it grew sharper, closer, carrying words shaped like a human throat. It was Ethan's voice, calling my name. "Hey, come on, let me in. It's just me." I sat bolt upright in my bunk, my breath fogging in the air. The sound came from the door at the far end of the corridor, the same door he'd opened. "Don't you hear me?" he called again, cheerful, casual, like nothing had happened. My skin prickled. Every instinct screamed not to move, not to answer. The rules echoed in my mind. Never open the door after dark without another witness. But the voice laughed, familiar, coaxing. "It's fine. I'm fine. Just open up. I'm freezing out here." I pressed my palms over my ears, but it didn't stop. The voice seeped through the walls, through my bones, a perfect imitation. Then, just as suddenly as it began, silence. The heaters thumped, the wind howled, the corridor stayed empty. But I knew one thing with a certainty that chilled me deeper than the Arctic ever could. Ethan was gone, and whatever had taken him was still outside, waiting, whispering with his voice. Midnight in the station always felt heavier than the hours before it. The lights dimmed, the heaters hummed lower, and the silence pressed in so tightly it seemed the walls themselves were listening. We'd learned to fear that hour, when the dark outside became absolute, and the rules seemed to breathe louder in our heads. That's when the radio came alive. I had been on late watch, sitting in the comms room with its bank of outdated equipment and blinking green lights. The place always smelled faintly of ozone and old dust, wires coiled like veins under the panels. I was half dozing in my chair when the static shifted. At first it was nothing, just a crackle, a change in rhythm. Then it sharpened into words. "Hello? Hello? It's me." The voice was faint, warped by distance, but I recognized it instantly. Ethan. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The same Ethan who had opened the door 3 nights ago and been swallowed whole. The same Ethan whose parka still sat slumped against the threshold like an abandoned scarecrow. The radio hissed, then cleared just enough for the words to slide through. "Can anyone hear me? I need help. Please, please, I'm freezing out here." My hand hovered over the mic. Every instinct screamed to answer. His voice was raw with desperation, cracking the way a human voice cracks when it's breaking. But the binder on the wall of the comms room loomed in my peripheral vision, its rules etched into my memory like scars. Rule 7. Never respond to calls for help over the radio after midnight. I clenched my fists in my lap. I couldn't do it. I couldn't break another rule, not after what I'd seen. But then Derek walked in, his hair wild from sleep, his heavy boots dragging across the floor. He rubbed his eyes, squinting at me, then at the radio. His face drained of color when he heard the voice. "Derek, you there? It's me. You have to let me in. Please, I can see the lights from here. Please, I'm so cold." Derek staggered forward, one hand reaching for the mic. His lips trembled, forming Ethan's name without sound. His whole body shook with guilt. Ethan had been under his supervision when he vanished. "Don't," I whispered, but the word cracked and died in my throat. Derek's hand hovered over the mic, fingers twitching. "It's him," he muttered. "It sounds like him." "It's not him." My own voice came out harsher than I intended, scraping like sandpaper. "It can't be." The radio hissed, then sharpened again, clearer, louder. "Don't listen to her, Derek. She's lying. You know me. You know my voice." The static swelled, almost like breathing, long inhales, ragged exhales. My skin crawled as if the sound itself were leaning against me, pressing into my ears.
Derek's face twisted with pain. "He sounds so real," he whispered. "So alive." "Think about the rules," I pointed to the binder. My hand shook, but I kept it raised like a weapon. "Rule 7. You know what happens when you break them." But Derek's hand drifted closer to the mic, his knuckles white with strain. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Derek, don't let me die out here. Please, I'll never forgive you if you don't answer." The words sliced like knives, and I saw Derek flinch as though struck. I lunged, slamming my hand down on his wrist before he could press the transmit button. He jerked, startled, and the mic clattered back into its cradle. The radio erupted. The voice warped instantly, as if a mask had been ripped away. Ethan's tone collapsed into a guttural rasp, vowels stretched until they broke apart into animal sounds. The words dissolved into something hungry and raw. Let me in." Then came the shriek. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it was both and more. A sound so sharp and unnatural it rattled the glass in the windows and made my teeth ache. The shriek rose higher and higher until the lights overhead flickered, buzzing like a swarm of trapped insects. I yanked the radio's main power switch. The speakers died with a final gasp of static. Silence slammed back into the room, thick and crushing. For a long time, Derek and I just sat there, panting, staring at the dead radio as though it might leap back to life. When Helen found us an hour later, she didn't even need to ask. She saw our faces, the sheen of sweat on our foreheads, the way Derek's hands still trembled. She didn't scold us, didn't need to. She just looked at the radio, then at the clock glowing red on the wall, 12:47 a.m. And she whispered, almost to herself, "They're learning how to sound like us." The days that followed were worse. Nobody trusted the radios anymore. Even during daylight, every crackle of static made us flinch. We spoke less, ate less. Conversations turned into half-sentences, cut short by suspicion. The guilt tore at Derek. I watched him unravel, avoiding sleep, pacing the corridors, muttering under his breath about second chances, about Ethan's voice, about how maybe rules were meant to be bent. Helen shadowed him constantly, her eyes sharp, her patience fraying. She knew temptation was the real threat, that one person's weakness could doom us all. And me? I couldn't stop hearing it. The way Ethan's tone had shifted, peeled back like skin revealing something underneath. I heard that shriek in my dreams, and always in the dream it was followed by silence. Not normal silence, but the kind where you know something is standing right behind you, waiting for you to turn around. The rules weren't just warnings, they were barriers, and whatever pressed against them was getting closer. On the 5th night after the call, I woke to the faint crackle of static bleeding through the walls. The radios were powered down, but the sound was there, seeping like water through stone. It wasn't words this time, not yet, just the rhythm of breathing, slow, patient, listening. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, shut my eyes, and told myself over and over, "Do not answer, do not answer. Do not answer." But in the darkness, it felt like the breathing wasn't on the radio anymore. It was in the room, and I wasn't sure how much longer the rules would hold. The storm eased just enough for me to be sent outside. Our weather instruments had iced over, the anemometer locked in place like a frozen clock hand, and Helen insisted the readings couldn't be allowed to fail. She pressed the checklist into my hands like it was a lifeline. I knew the real lifeline was the rule book tucked into my coat against my chest. Outside, the cold struck like teeth sinking into bare skin. The blizzard hadn't passed, it had only grown sly, thinning itself into ribbons of white so that the air seemed clear for a heartbeat, only to thicken again the next second. I tugged my hood tighter, adjusted the frost-crusted goggles, and forced my boots through snow that grabbed at my legs with every step. The wind screamed in my ears, the pitch rising and falling like voices carried on some far-off frequency. It wasn't just noise, it had rhythm, an almost conversational cadence, as though it was whispering to itself about me. I tried to keep my eyes low, fixed on the metal tower where the instruments jutted out like skeletal arms. The snow blinded, the cold gnawed, but I kept telling myself, task first, rules always. That when I saw movement. At first, it was only a flicker in the periphery, the kind of false shadow your mind conjures when visibility is near zero. But then the shape steadied, walking slow, steady steps across the field of snow to my left. My chest clenched. It was someone. The outline was too human to mistake for bent steel or drifting ice. The shape leaned slightly to one side as it walked, a familiar lopsided gait. My stomach sank. It looked like Peter, the new hire, who had vanished when he broke rule number 3, the one who opened the door after dark. I hadn't seen his body since. We never had. Rule number 10 echoed in my skull, louder than the wind. If you see a familiar face in the snow, don't look twice. I turned back to the instruments immediately, shoving trembling hands against the iced metal. My gloves squealed against the frost as I scraped, forcing myself not to look again, not to think about the stagger of those steps. My breath fogged up the inside of my goggles, but I kept repeating it like a prayer. Don't look, don't look. The wind shifted. From the corner of my eye, the figure drew nearer. I couldn't help myself. Just a flicker of the eyes, a second glance, and that was enough. Its head snapped toward me. The movement was wrong, too fast, like a hinge breaking. One moment it was walking with Peter's familiar stagger. The next, its head twisted in my direction in a blur of speed, snapping to face me as though it had always been staring. Through the storm, the face was blurred, no eyes, no mouth, just a smear of shifting features that seemed to crawl like worms beneath the skin. I froze. The cold bit deeper, punishing my hesitation. I couldn't breathe. The figure twitched once, then stopped. Around it, the storm thickened, and I realized the wind had gone quiet, not silent, but quieter, as if holding its breath. Then I saw others. Shapes dotted the white around me, each one shambling, walking in slow arcs through the storm. Some limped, some dragged their arms too low. A few tilted their heads in ways that suggested broken necks. All of them familiar in the worst way. Walks I'd memorized, gaits I'd seen every day in the halls of the station. Co-workers. My stomach lurched, my mind screamed at me to run, but my boots felt cemented into the snow. I yanked my gaze down, focusing on the half-frozen gauge before me, and fumbled the tool from my pocket. My fingers shook violently as I forced the ice from the joint, pretending the storm wasn't alive with faces. The metal screeched as it came loose. The sound ripped through the silence. When I looked up again, just a reflex, just a blink, every figure was facing me. They hadn't moved in steps. They hadn't closed the distance naturally. They had simply shifted in unison, all at once, jerking into new positions so they were angled toward me. I couldn't see their faces clearly through the storm, but I knew they were waiting for me to look again, waiting for me to acknowledge them one time too many. The wind screamed suddenly, high-pitched and furious, as if punishing me for breaking rule number 10. I tore the gauge free and stumbled back, my breath ripping out in clouds. The snow seemed to grab at my legs harder now, dragging me down with every step. My heart hammered against my ribs as though it wanted out. Behind me, I heard a crunch. Not the wind, not the snow shifting, A boot step. Too close. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The rule was still alive in my mind. Don't look twice. But I already had, and the air seemed to buzz with consequence, as if the storm itself was deciding how to punish me. The station loomed ahead, lights dim and yellow against the whiteout. I stumbled for it, nearly crawling, boots sinking deep. The crunches followed, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always there. By the time I slammed into the door and pounded on it, I was sobbing under my breath. Helen yanked it open, dragging me inside with more strength than I thought she had. She shoved the door closed, spinning the locks in practiced motions. "What happened?" she demanded, her eyes searching mine. I tried to answer, but my throat was raw, my lips numb. All I could do was shake my head. Her face softened just slightly. She glanced at the frost thickening on my coat, then at the window behind me. The glass was already fogging, as though something was breathing against it from the outside. "You looked, didn't you?" she whispered. I couldn't deny it. I didn't need to. The way her expression fell said she already knew. And then, from outside, muffled by the storm and the steel walls, came the crunch of boots. Slow, deliberate, circling the station. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I couldn't, but because I was terrified of what would be waiting if I closed my eyes long enough to dream. The hatch was never meant to be found. I came across it by accident, following a drip. Water, or what I thought was water, had begun seeping down one of the metal walls near the supply room. At first, it was just a faint line of frost melt, but by the next day, it had thickened into a thin rivulet, running down to pool darkly on the floor. When I knelt and pressed my glove to the wall, I felt a draft, a pulse of cold, older than the storm outside. That's when I saw it, the faint outline of a hatch set into the floor, rimmed with frost so thick it looked like bone-white coral. The metal was warped with age, its hinges swollen with rust. No one had mentioned a basement. I'd memorized the schematics during training. There wasn't supposed to be one. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it shut, but the rules had taught me one thing. What you don't know will kill you faster than what you do. The handle groaned as I pulled. Ice cracked, spraying shards across the floor like broken glass. The hatch gave way with a screech that echoed through the corridors. The air that spilled out was different, heavy. It reeked of rot and mold, a dampness that didn't belong in this frozen wasteland. I fetched a lantern from the equipment room, lit it, and lowered myself down the narrow iron ladder. The rungs were slick, the metal soft with corrosion. My breath fogged in the beam of light, drifting downward like smoke into the dark. The basement wasn't big, just a square room carved into the foundation, walls sweating with condensation. The frost didn't seem to touch this place. Instead, mildew clung to the corners, black mold creeping up from the floor. And everywhere, relics. Stacks of belongings. Old coats, boots stiff with age, canvas bags collapsed into piles. There were tools scattered across a workbench, their edges eaten with rust. Lanterns, half-burned candles, tin cups, notebooks swollen with damp. The lantern light passed over them like it was moving through a mausoleum. Nothing had been touched in years, decades maybe. I picked up a photograph from the bench. It crumbled at the edges, but the image was still clear enough. Smiling faces, 8 men in heavy parkas, their arms slung around one another. Behind them, the same station I now lived in, newer then, its paint unpeeled, its windows intact. Their eyes caught me. They looked so alive. I set it down and opened one of the notebooks. The ink had bled in places, but I could still make out the handwriting. Rule number 1, never go outside alone after dark. Rule number 2, do not eat food that has been left unattended. Rule number 3, if you hear footsteps in the hall, count them. If they stop before 7, hide. I froze. These weren't our rules. They were older, different. Flipping further, I saw dates, 1973, 1976, 1982. Each set of entries ended abruptly, the handwriting trailing off mid-sentence.
Some of the pages were soaked in brown stains that had dried into brittle crusts. Blood. On the far wall, pinned under a shard of broken glass, were dozens of pages torn from other journals. Rules written again and again, each in a different hand. The newer rules matched our book exactly. And each edition was written in the same dark substance. The ink always thick, always dried a deep brown red. Blood. My lantern hissed softly, the flame flickering. The shadows of the relics seemed to lean toward me, stretching across the damp walls. I picked up another photograph. This one older, black and white. A group of 6, women and men together, holding mugs of coffee. Behind them, a sign, Polar Expedition, 1951. They were smiling too, but the corners of their eyes betrayed something different. A tightness, a strain. I found more journals, stacked like gravestones. Each told the same story. Hope at the beginning, rules scrawled in urgency, warnings half explained. By the last entries, the words deteriorated into paranoia. Pages filled with repeated sentences. It knows the rules. It learns faster than we do. Don't let it see your face. I flipped faster, my heart hammering. One journal ended with a single line, pressed so hard into the paper it tore through. The ice is watching. I staggered back, my lantern throwing wild shadows across the room. Something moved in the corner. Just a shifting of darkness, a trick of the light, I told myself. But the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. The floor near the far wall was cracked, frost bleeding upward through the cement. It pulsed faintly, like something beneath was breathing. That was when I noticed the rule book on the bench. Not our rule book, theirs. Bound in a different cover, pages yellowed, but still alive. When I brushed my glove across it, the leather was warm. I opened it. Inside, the first page was blank. Then, as I watched, words bled across the surface, letter by letter, written in fresh red strokes. You are not the first. You will not be the last. The lantern sputtered. The flame stretched thin, almost extinguished. I backed away, clutching the book, heart pounding so loud I thought it would bring the ceiling down. When I climbed the ladder and slammed the hatch shut, frost raced instantly back over the edges, sealing it like a wound. I stood in the corridor, my breath ragged, the new book heavy in my hands. Upstairs, I could hear Marcus and Helen arguing, their voices raised, brittle with fear. But I didn't move toward them. Instead, I looked down at the book. The words on the first page had already changed. We are watching. We are waiting. Follow the rules. I dropped it, but the echo of the lantern-lit basement stayed with me long after. The smiling faces in those photographs haunted me most of all. Not because they were gone, but because, for a moment, I could almost see us among them. Helen, Marcus, Jackson before he shattered, and me. Another team smiling for a camera, doomed to vanish beneath the ice. The only difference was that now the thing beneath the ice knew us better. The days and nights had long since blended together. The blizzard outside never seemed to end, and even when it softened for a few hours, the white pressed in against the windows like a living wall. Inside, the station had taken on a different kind of storm, an invisible one. Every bunk room was thick with the sweat, damp wool, and unease. Every corridor felt narrower than I remembered, the walls sweating condensation that froze into a delicate sheen of frost by morning. We all obeyed the rules without question now, or at least most of us did. The list had grown more sacred than scripture. Each time I looked at it pinned to the mess hall wall, the edges curling, the ink bleeding from condensation, I felt the weight of it in my chest. It wasn't just superstition anymore. We'd seen the rules enforce themselves. We'd seen the punishment for defiance. Rule 15 was the one that sat heavy on all of us. Do not sleep alone. The bunk rooms were cramped. 4 narrow cots pressed against the steel walls, blankets thin as paper, pillows stuffed with something that smelled faintly of mildew. Sleep had become an act of survival, not rest. We huddled together, too exhausted to complain about the snoring, the shifting, the unwashed bodies inches from our faces. At first it was humiliating, now it was routine. But routines breed rebellion, and exhaustion makes rebels of us all. It was Jana who broke Rule 15. Jana, the quiet technician with the hollow eyes and a cough that rattled in his lungs whenever the cold seeped too deep into his bones. He'd been slipping further away each day. Less talk, less food, less fight in his movements. He would sit in the mess hall staring at his mug until the tea got cold in his hands.
The night it happened, we were all too tired to argue when he muttered that he couldn't stand the crowded bunk room another second. His voice was flat, the way someone might say they were stepping outside for air. He dragged his blanket down the hall to one of the unused quarters, ignoring the way we all stiffened at the sound of his footsteps. "Jonah," I said, too quietly, too late. He didn't look back. The rest of us, Anders, Clark, myself, lay down in our bunks without speaking. The rule was written. We all knew what it meant to break it, but none of us wanted to be the one to drag Jonah back by force. Maybe, selfishly, we hoped the rule was weaker than the others. Maybe we hoped the punishment wouldn't come. That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls felt too close, the air too thin. Every shift of fabric sounded like claws dragging across metal. The darkness seemed to press against my eyes. Sometime, deep into the hours when the station's generators hummed like a heartbeat, I heard it. A muffled sound, distant but sharp enough to slice through the fog of half-sleep. A scream. Not the kind that tears from a throat in a single burst, but a smothered, desperate cry, as though Jonah was trying to shout with a hand clamped over his mouth. I bolted upright, the springs of my bunk creaking under me. Across the room, I saw May's eyes glowing faintly in the dark, wide open. Clark was already sitting up, his silhouette rigid. None of us said anything. The air was too thick with dread. Then the pounding started. It came from down the hall, from Jonah's room. A heavy, frantic slamming that shook the thin walls of the station. The sound was wrong. It didn't echo like fists on steel, but thudded with a wet, uneven rhythm, as if something softer and heavier than flesh was striking again and again. The smell reached us next. Not blood, not at first, but a sharp metallic tang mixed with the reek of cold air flooding where it shouldn't. Like the walls themselves had cracked open and let the storm crawl inside. May whispered, "We can't go." Her voice cracked, almost pleading, as if she was reminding herself as much as us. The pounding grew louder, closer. For a moment, it seemed like it was coming from all around, as if the walls themselves were alive with fists, claws, something demanding to be let in or out. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just noise, it was inside me, vibrating my bones. And then, suddenly, silence. Not the gentle silence of a storm's lull, but the kind that makes you realize every sound has been ripped away. Even the generator seemed to fade, leaving only the rasp of our breaths in the dark. I don't know when I fell asleep after that. Maybe exhaustion claimed me. Maybe something else pushed me under. All I remember is the suffocating weight of silence pressing me into the thin mattress until I couldn't fight it anymore. By morning, Jonah was gone. His bed was a ruin, sheets shredded, frame gouged with deep claw marks that cut into the steel itself. The air in the room was colder than the hall outside, like an open wound in the station's skin. There was no blood, no body, nothing but the marks and the echo of what we heard. And just like that, Jonah ceased to exist. We gathered in the mess hall, staring at the rule book in silence. The list looked different that morning. The words seemed darker, sharper. My eyes fell again and again on rule number 15, as though the ink itself had grown bolder overnight. Do not sleep alone. Clark broke the silence first. We don't talk about it. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, brittle as glass. No one argued. We sat in silence, the smell of coffee thick in the air, though no one touched it. Outside, the storm pressed on, as endless and suffocating as ever. But that night, when we crowded into the bunks again, none of us could close our eyes without hearing Jonas' muffled screams echoing in the walls. None of us dared sleep alone again. The blizzard began with no warning. One moment, the wind was its usual dull roar beyond the steel walls, and the next, it became a living thing, a beast circling the station, pounding and shrieking, rattling doors in their frames. Snow slammed against the windows so hard it sounded like hail. The pressure in the walls groaned like bones about to snap. It was as if the storm had been waiting, building, biding its time beneath the horizon, and then lunged at once. Inside, the rules became lifelines. We huddled in the common room first, trying to ride out the first hour together. The air was hot with breath, with the stink of sweat and the clinging tang of unwashed bodies. Nobody dared split off. The rule book lay open on the table like scripture, its pages fluttering in the drafts that wormed their way under the doors. Rule number 3, keep the lights on. Rule 5, lock all doors before nightfall. Rule 15, do not sleep alone. Over and over, we read them aloud as if speaking them might protect us. But the storm pressed harder and the power flickered. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, dimmed, then came back brighter, stuttering like a heartbeat in distress. The generator groaned deep in the belly of the station. That low mechanical pulse became the sound of our survival. If it failed, so would the lights. And if the lights went out? The first sound came from the corridor. Not the wind, no, this was inside. A whisper, soft, familiar. My name. I froze, my breath caught halfway up my throat. Across from me, Ramirez sat stiff, staring at the door to the hallway. His lips pressed together, his skin slick with sweat. We all heard it. The voice came again, slithering through the air ducts, curling against the metal walls like smoke. It wasn't just my name this time. It was all of ours, one after another, in a strange roll call. Each syllable elongated, stretched thin, as though the throat speaking them wasn't built for language, but had learned enough to mimic. Then came the shadows. At first, they seemed like tricks of the flickering light, shapes moving just outside the circle of our lamps, rippling across walls, stretching too tall for the ceilings. But then one of them brushed against the glass of the observation window, and the pane frosted instantly from the touch, veins of ice spiraling outward. We backed away from the walls. The emergency light switched without warning, bathing everything in red. The whole room became a heartbeat, pulsing in time with the generator's dying stuttering. Every corridor looked drenched in blood. Every shadow was solid now, breaking free from the walls, moving on its own. The rules were the only thing between us. Lights on, doors locked, never alone. We scattered in pairs, racing to check every door, every lock. My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice. Behind the doors, something moved, scratching, clawing, pressing against the steel as though testing it. I could hear their nails drag across metal, squealing, leaving long dents that hadn't been there before. Ramirez clung to me as we worked down the hall, his flashlight jittering wildly. He muttered the rules under his breath like prayer. I joined him. Anything to fill the silence between the sounds, the whispers in the vents, the scrapping on the walls, the heavy drag of something along the ceiling panels. But then the generator coughed.
The lights dimmed to a sickly glow, sputtered, almost died. Panic slammed through us harder than the code ever could. Without lights, the rules would fail. Without rules, we would be nothing but meat in the dark. Someone had to go out into the storm. It was Reed who volunteered, though volunteer is too strong a word. We all looked at each other, and his eyes broke first. He was the youngest, a wiry technician with trembling hands that never seemed to steady. He said he knew the generator best, that it would only take a few minutes. We didn't believe him, not really, but we let him say it because the alternative was arguing while the lights went black around us. He zipped his coat, pulled on his goggles, and we sealed the inner airlock behind him. Through the small round window, I saw the storm swallow him. One step, two, and he was gone, erased into white. The door rattled as the blizzard battered it, snow leaking in through seams that should have been airtight. We waited. Minutes dragged, stretching thin as hours. The red emergency lights pulsed, shadows flickered in and out of doorways. Every whisper was louder now, closer, some of them wearing Reed's voice already, calling us to open the door. The generator groaned again. The lights flickered. For a moment, they flared so bright I thought Reed must have fixed it. But then they dimmed, stuttered, and the hum died altogether. The lights went out. Darkness slammed into the station like a solid wall. In that instant, every rule we clung to became meaningless. The shadows rushed in from all directions. I felt them brushing my arms, cold as ice water, claws tracing the outline of my ribs through the fabric of my coat. Whispers roared in my ears, every voice I had ever known calling my name. Someone screamed. I think it was Ramirez. Then the backup generator kicked in, flooding the halls with red once more. The shadows shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and withdrew. Not gone, never gone, but lurking just outside the light. We stumbled back into the common room, sealing the doors. Roll call. 1, 2, 3, 4. Reed was missing. The outer airlock light blinked green. Someone had opened it. We rushed to the window just as the storm cleared enough for us to see the snow outside. Blood sprayed across the drifts in wild arcs, half buried already in white. No Reed, no body. Just his tool bag, shredded open, the contents strewn across the ice like entrails. And in the snow itself, claw marks. Not human, not even close. We shut the blinds, shut the door, shut everything. But the whispers never stopped. After Reed vanished in the storm, the station became a coffin we were all waiting to be buried in. No one said his name, not really. We muttered it once or twice, then stopped. The rules didn't tell us how to grieve, and grief felt dangerous here, like opening a door you weren't supposed to touch. But silence was worse. Silence let the whispers in. So instead, we worked. We moved through routines like puppets, tightening bolts that didn't need tightening, checking locks we had already sealed, counting supplies we knew were dwindling. The blizzard never let up. It circled and howled, a predator scenting weakness. Days blurred into nights, though the difference meant nothing here. Only the light and the generator's hum gave us time. And then came the discovery. It was Ramirez who noticed first. He was staring too long at the wall of the common room, his face pale as frost, lips moving in some half prayer I couldn't catch. I asked him what he saw, and he pointed. At first, I thought it was just condensation, a little frost creeping along the steel. But then I leaned closer and saw it wasn't random. It was writing. Carved into the frost itself, delicate as veins. Letters, numbers, words, rule fragments. Some I recognized. Do not sleep alone. Others were new. Never answer the voice that knows your mother's name. The walls weren't bare anymore. They were covered in a skin of secrets we hadn't noticed until now. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not that anyone truly slept here. More like we drifted in shallow, jagged fragments, never letting go fully, always with one ear open for whispers in the vents. But I lay awake longer than usual, watching the red glow of the backup lights pulse across the ceiling, counting the seconds between flickers. And I kept thinking about the basement.
The hatch I'd found days before, rimed with frost, its handle cold enough to burn my fingers through gloves. I hadn't dared open it then, none of us had. But now the station itself felt like it was pressing us downward, whispering through the walls, demanding we look. In the morning, if you could call it morning, I told the others. Ramirez refused flat out. O'Donnell wouldn't even meet my eyes. But Morgan, the oldest of us, the one who had been stationed here the longest, just sat quietly and stared at her coffee until it went cold in her hands. Finally, she said, "You'll see things you can't put back." And then she gave me the key. The hatch screeched when I turned it. Rust flaked like scabs. Cold air breathed up from the crack, damp and sour, carrying the smell of mold beneath the frost. We lowered a lantern down first, its glow trembling against stones slick with ice. The basement wasn't on the station blueprints. The walls down there were older, rawer, not the neat steel of government construction, but something rougher, almost like a bunker poured decades earlier and left to rot beneath the newer structure. The air stank of wet stone and paper left too long in the damp. And everywhere there were belongings. Stacked in corners, hung on hooks, piled neatly, almost reverently. Jackets with name tags I didn't recognize. Pairs of boots lined up like soldiers. A box of watches, each still ticking faintly, though their owners were long gone. A cracked pair of glasses folded and set atop a folded uniform. I felt like I'd walked into a mausoleum. But the worst part were the photos. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, strung on twine across the walls, pinned like butterflies. Smiling teams in crisp uniforms, standing in the snow outside the station, arms around each other's shoulders. Groups of 10, 12, 15, always more than we had now. Their faces blurred at the edges, yellowing with age. And yet the backgrounds were the same. The station behind them, the same snow, the same storm-blurred horizon. Every single group had vanished. On the far wall, journals lay stacked in a crate. I picked one at random and opened it. The ink bled and warped from moisture, but the words were still legible. They were rules. Pages upon pages of them, scrawled in shaky hands, written over decades. Some matched the ones we lived by now. Others were stranger. If you see yourself in the window, do not wave back. Do not let the storm know your birthday. Never whistle after midnight. Each entry ended the same way, with blood. Signature signed not in ink, but in dark, rust-colored stains smeared across the page. I flipped further and found something worse. Drawings. Crude sketches of shapes beneath the ice. Things with too many limbs, too many eyes, drawn over and over by different hands across decades. Some labeled them watchers. Others just wrote, "It knows us." When I looked up from the journal, I realized Morgan wasn't with us anymore. She hadn't followed down the stairs. She'd stayed behind, waiting. And when we returned to the common room, she was gone.
On the table lay a single sheet from the rule book, one I hadn't noticed before. Rule number 22. Do not look for the missing. They are already claimed. The words shimmered as though written fresh. When I touched the paper, my fingers came away sticky. Blood. The rules weren't history, they were alive. And whatever had claimed the teams before us was still here, watching, adapting, learning through every broken commandment. That night, the whispers grew bolder. Not just in the vents, not just outside, but in the bunk room, beside my ear, breathing the words of the rules back to me, as though testing if I believed them. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just lay there, clutching the rule book against my chest like a talisman, counting each heartbeat until dawn. But dawn never came. Only the red glow. Only the storm. Only the feeling that now we were part of a cycle older than we could understand. A cycle of rules, obedience, blood, and disappearance, endlessly repeating. And the walls themselves seemed to be listening. I used to think the rules were guardrails, flimsy warnings against something vast and unknowable. But after the basement, after the photos and journals, I began to understand they weren't warnings at all. They were bargains. We were being tolerated, and bargains don't last forever. The fourth broken rule came the next night, though the days had already stopped meaning anything. Our clocks ticked, but time bent in the blizzard. The storm had been howling for weeks now, and yet never shifted, never weakened. We lived in its lungs, each gust a breath waiting to smother us. Rule number 7 was simple enough. Never leave the lights off for longer than a minute. We all followed it religiously. Even in sleep, our bulbs burned, humming overhead like mechanical bees, filling the rooms with a sterile glow that felt more protective than any weapon. But the generator had been limping since Reed disappeared. The fuel was low, circuits flickered at random. And that night, the lights went out. We were eating in silence, cold rations that tasted like dust when the hum died. The bulbs blinked twice and went black. For a second, nobody moved. Then we all grabbed flashlights, shaking hands, fumbling with switches, beams cutting weak cones through the dark. "Count," Ramirez hissed. "1, 2, 3, O'Donnell started, her voice trembling. But the words were drowned by a sound, a dragging. Like claws on steel, scraping slowly down the hallway. The storm outside roared in answer, rattling the windows. The dark seemed to thicken, pressing against our flashlights, swallowing their reach. Shadows moved where there should have been none, long-limbed, twitching, bending in ways that made no sense. 30 seconds. "Fix it," Ramirez shouted. "Get the generator back." "I'll go," O'Donnell said, and before anyone could stop her, she ran into the hall. Her light bobbed with her footsteps, then turned a corner. Silence followed, broken only by that dragging sound. 45 seconds. Morgan wasn't with us anymore, but I could almost hear her voice in my head. "You'll see things you can't put back." And then O'Donnell screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain, not at first. More like shock, then terror, then silence. Her flashlight hit the floor and rolled, beams spinning across the wall. For a moment, in its circle of light, I saw something crouched low, its limbs bending in wrong directions, its face pressed too close to the wall, as though sniffing through steel. Then the light blinked out. A minute passed. The rules shattered. The generator roared back to life, lights bursting overhead, but O'Donnell's chair at the table was empty. On her plate, where her food had been, lay something else, a smear of frost and a single human tooth, glistening wet. We didn't speak, none of us, not that night, not the next. Her name was swallowed like Reed's, like Morgan's, another sacrifice to the storm. But the station remembered. The walls where her flashlight beam had landed were stained with handprints, dozens of them, all pressed outward, as if something on the other side had been clawing to get through. Some were small, child-sized, others stretched longer than any human arm. I touched one, and the frost hissed under my fingers. For a second, I swear I felt heat, like blood pulsing through veins. The rules weren't just written in journals or carved in frost anymore. They were etched into the walls of this place, into its bones. Every broken commandment strengthened it. Every vanished life deepened its hunger. That night, I tried to sleep, clutching the rulebook to my chest. The words inside burned into my brain. Do not sleep alone. Do not leave the lights off. Do not answer the voices. But the more I read, the more I realized the truth. The rules weren't just there to protect us. They were there to keep it entertained. And O'Donnell's screams still echoed in the pipes, carried along the vents like a lullaby, as though the storm itself was singing. I should have known it would end like this. The rules were never written to save us, only to delay what waited, patient and hungry, just outside. Each page had felt inevitable, each ink-stained command a step toward this moment. I remember the way my hands trembled when I turned to the very back of the rulebook, to a page I could have sworn wasn't there before. The paper was yellowed, edges brittle with frost, but the words were fresh, scratched in a dark red that hadn't yet dried. When only one remains, write the rules anew. The sentence bled into the fibers as if it wanted to sink deeper than ink ever could. I shut the book too quickly, as if slamming it closed could undo what I'd seen. But even with my eyes closed, I could feel those words still burning in the dark behind them. By then, there were only 3 of us left, me, Harris, and Lydia. We hadn't spoken much in days. Every word felt dangerous, like the entities outside were listening, waiting for a crack to slip through. Still, I knew we were all thinking the same thing. We were thinning out, one by one, and soon the rules themselves would turn on us again. That night, the storm quieted for the first time in weeks. The silence was worse than the wind. Without the constant roar of snow and ice tearing at the walls, we could hear everything: the drip of melting frost, the buzz of the emergency lights, the faint creak of the steel frame shifting under cold. But we could also hear the other sound: breathing. Not ours. It pressed against the walls from outside, soft and slow, like dozens of lungs expanding and collapsing in unison. The kind of breathing you hear when you lean too close to someone's ear. And beneath it, faint scratching, like nails tracing the seams of the building, testing for weakness. Lydia curled in on herself on her bunk, arms around her knees. Harris sat at the table, staring at the rule book as if he could make it rewrite itself by will alone. "We're almost done," he whispered. His voice sounded thinner than I'd ever heard it. "One of us goes next, then another, then you know what it said." Neither of us asked how he knew. We had all seen the final page by then. We had all pretended we hadn't. Sleep was impossible. The air felt too thick, heavy with the cold breath of things just outside. My eyelids would sink, only for the scratching to rise, dragging me awake with a jolt. When the lights flickered, I thought my heart might stop. Sometime in the dead hours, I heard movement. I lifted my head to see Harris slipping on his boots, clutching the lantern. "What are you doing?" I hissed, louder than I meant to. He didn't look at me. His face was pale, eyes bloodshot. "The generator," he muttered. "I hear it stalling. If the lights go." "The rules," I snapped. "You can't go out alone. You know what happens." He gritted his teeth, jaw shaking. "Better me than both of you." And before I could move, he shoved the hatch open and was swallowed by the night. I wanted to follow. I wanted to drag him back, screaming if I had to. But my legs wouldn't move. Fear pinned me down like ice poured into my veins. Minutes passed. The lantern outside swayed, a dim glow half buried in snow. Then the light snapped out. The silence that followed was worse than screaming. When the storm finally lifted at dawn, there was no Harris. Only the imprint of boots leading into the white, and then nothing, not even blood. That left just me and Lydia. She didn't last another night. I woke to the sound of whimpering. Her bunk was empty, sheets torn, claw marks raked across the steel frame. The smell of copper hung in the air, sharp and metallic. I searched the station, calling her name until my throat ached. But all I found was her scarf, frozen stiff near the hatch. By then, I didn't need the rule book to tell me. I was alone, and that meant it was my turn. The entities knew it too. That night they gathered, pressing closer than ever before. Their shadows spilled across the walls when the lantern light